public lecture for our series, Contemporary History and the Future of Memory. We've had Isban Rev from Central European University our first speaker, and we've had François Leonnet from UCLA before, and Gauri Viswanathan is our final speaker, and this will culminate with a symposium on the 9th of April in the same venue. So please, if you're free, mark that date down. It's a great honor to welcome Gauri Viswanathan, class of 1933 professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. Over the last 2 decades, she has provided radical histories for some of the disciplines most central to our lives, those we inhabit with the ease of breathing, without realizing that the stories of their origin can be drastically different from the way they are practiced today. It's the much-needed caveat to the future of our memory, about institutions and disciplines, about spiritual as well as intellectual discourses. Her first book, Masks of Conquest, published in 1989, reveals the very origins of our discipline, English studies, as implicated in exercise of economic and political power, specifically that of colonialism. The institution of English studies, in this analysis, goes further back in the past beyond the canonical story of F.R. Leavis and Cambridge, to be traced overseas in British colonial rule in South Asia. English literature, she shows, gets established as a discipline in India in order to create and sustain an ideological environment which can mask the political and economic exploitation of colonialism. This book immediately established Professor Viswanathan as an insightful scholar of colonial modernity who is able to read the political significance of institutions and discourses not usually linked to the plane of the political. In her second book, Outside the Fort, published in 1998, she directs this skill to another crucial process that is ordinarily seen as distant from the worldly, that of religious conversion. She unmoors conversion from its usual sphere of the transcendental and shows it as a process that destabilizes the political life of the community and the nation state. In her most recent work, some of which we read today in the morning's workshop, many of these extraordinarily rich interests have seemed to come together, leading to a questioning of the established wisdom about the secular origins of literary modernity. She critiques the secularization thesis behind the evolution of modern literary and critical consciousness, crucially arguing that, and I quote, "The primary rupture is not between reason and religion, but rather between belief and imagination." Throughout her career so far, this remarkably erudite scholar has embodied the spirit of self-reflection that seems so urgent today, not only to the disciplines with which we work, but in the larger public sphere within which we live. Looking into the future of memory, we can now say for certain that a history of our most central discourses and disciplines will not be complete without her radically worldly insights. No better person, therefore, to conclude our series this year. Please welcome Gauri.
Thank you so much, Shekat, for this very generous introduction, and for inviting me in the first place. It was really a pleasure meeting some of you this morning, and those who were there at the colloquium may see some continuity between this morning's discussion and what I'm going to talk about today. Shekat mentioned that I do some self-reflection, and that self-reflection generally extends towards the kinds of work we do within our disciplines. And I have been revisiting some of the ideas I'd been working with when I wrote my book on conversion, and I've been extending the thought about the historical conversions, particularly around the 19th and 20th centuries, around the time of modern nationalism, but looking at conversion perhaps more reflexively by connecting it with some of the so-called esoteric histories that I've also been studying. And those of you who were there this morning know that I have been very interested in the study of Theosophy, the Theosophical Society, and in general with the study of alternative religious movements. and I've been most interested in trying to write about secularism from a perspective that takes into account the histories of what came to be known as fragments that do not get integrated into world religions. And so the way in which I've been trying to get into that material is by working with the concept of the secret and secrecy. And so I begin with an unlikely starting point for probing the complexities of crypto-conversion, that is, Derrida's musings on religion and secrecy, and their implications for a broader understanding of the stakes of religious conversion. The Gift of Death, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, it's a work which closely follows the human rights activist Jan Patočka's aptly titled Heretical Essays on the Philosophy of History, is Derrida's most sustained meditation on religion, and specifically on crypto-conversion. Among the most striking features of his argument is an insistence on the idea of the secret as key to the dynamic process of conversion. Derrida views conversion not as a movement between religions, but rather the subordination of one mystery to another. In a neat progression of religious forms, each embedded in its successor, orgiastic mystery, as Derrida terms it, is subsumed by Platonic mystery, which in turn is superseded and incorporated by Christian mystery. Again, following from Patočka, Derrida finds that conversion retains whatever it displaces in the form of a secret, which persists at the core of religious transformation as an enduring reminder of earlier religious forms and mysteries. In his near obsession with the notion of the secret in his writings on religion, Derrida uncannily evokes a predecessor with whom he has rarely, if at all, been compared, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. As I will argue in this paper, Blavatsky's occult writings set the stage for the kinds of speculation on crypto-conversion, conscience, and responsibility that subsequently engaged Derrida. I will conclude my talk by offering a close reading of an occult text that is W.B. Yeats's The Manuscript of Leo Africanus, that serves as a literary unfolding of the themes outlined by Blavatsky and Derrida, achieving a breakthrough of sorts in forcing Yeats to acknowledge an occluded history that can only be told in the terms of crypto-conversion, in this case, of a 12th century African slave forcibly converted to Christianity and turned into a native informant of African history and geography. The irony that hangs over the slave's narrative is that it is as a dead, disembodied voice that his secret Muslim identity is finally vindicated, offering an object lesson to Yeats's feelings of alienation from both Ireland and Catholicism. At one level, Derrida's description of the secret appears to resonate with the typical definition of the Marrano as an individual who retains aspects of a secret religious identity while avowing allegiance to another religion adopted either by force or inducements, be they material or spiritual. However, Derrida is less interested in ethnicity and identity than in historical knowledge. Like Blavatsky, he deploys the concept of the secret to signal the histories hidden from view in the course of religious change. In this respect, he implicitly contests the notion that individuals, in their practice of an embargoed faith, preserve an identity threatened with erasure, an identity expressed in ethnic, racial, or gendered terms. Rather, he takes a broad view of religious formation as a series of substitutions of one religious mystery by another, which at the same time encrusts one secret within another, as a defiant sign that total obliteration of past beliefs is impossible. The secret for Derrida is associated not with hidden identity but with the denial of historicity, which he aims at recuperating by unpacking conversion's semantic meanings, beginning with the concept of change. Derrida disputes notions of passage or transition, just as he also challenges the idea that conversion is a movement from darkness to light. Instead, he reads conversion in terms of a repetitive economy of exchange that preserves a hidden core of meaning inaccessible to interpretation. There is no steady movement from one religion to another, no sloughing off the skin of the past. And I quote from Derrida, "The Platonic anabasis does not provide a passage from orgiastic mystery to non-mystery. It is a subordination of one mystery by another, the conversion from one secret to another." Indeed, the idea of the secret militates against conversion, which rests on a fundamental understanding of the new as entirely new, disconnected from the familiar and the old. The secret, on the other hand, is a sign of the persistence of the knowledge systems that had supposedly been supplanted, challenging the concept of newness embodied by conversion. The impossibility of newness entails that conversion can be no more than a succession of carefully preserved secrets, and for this reason it produces repression rather than destruction of pre-existing beliefs. Derrida establishes a set of equivalences between conversion and repression that ultimately supplants the more conventional associations between conversion and repudiation, either of the old belief systems or the institutions associated with them. In effect, he views repression as a constitutive feature of conversion. A string of successive displacements of the meanings associated with conversion leads to a breakthrough for Derrida, allowing him to propose that conversion is mourning because it denies the secret that it contains. Or as he notes, and I quote, "It keeps within oneself that whose death one must endure." The psychoanalytic economy of mourning not only preserves secrecy at the core of conversion, but it also cultivates the sense of a living death that must be repetitively experienced, reenacting the willed but inconclusive death of the old and the forsaken. Derrida goes on to say, in a description hauntingly reminiscent of Blavatsky's principal argument in her major works, The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled, and I quote, "What one keeps inside at the very moment that there comes into play a new experience of secrecy and a new structure of responsibility as an apportioning of mystery is the buried memory or crypt of a more ancient secret." Where Derrida departs from Blavatsky is in his introduction of the element of responsibility as an apportioning of mystery, an enigmatic phrase at best, suggesting that the formation of religious conscience entails the assignment of mystery to a pre-ethical moment identified with mystical rapture. Derrida complicates his argument further by maintaining that conscience, despite its attempts to separate itself from orgiastic ecstasy, always bears traces of its mystical origins. And he notes this coming to conscience still retains its mystical element. It still takes the form of a mystery, this time unacknowledged, undeclared, denied. Mystery and secrecy thwart the narration of a linear history towards the Platonic good, which in an endless cyclical movement is drawn back to that which it represses. To that extent, mystery and secrecy are interruptions. And Derrida, much like Blavatsky, turns to these moments in order to narrate the occluded history of self and the self's relation to responsibility. No account of conversion can be complete without a rendering of the convert's relation to self and world. And Derrida takes on this challenge when he writes, and I quote, the soul separates itself in recalling itself to itself. And so it becomes individualized, interiorized, becomes its very invisibility. Conscience is a reflection of the movement inward toward what Derrida calls subjectivizing interiority. This movement would be smooth and unhampered were it not for the role played by mystery and secrecy, which make it impossible not only to write a linear history of humankind, but also chart a straightforward genealogy of the individual. The stark reality for Derrida is that there is no revolutionizing conversion or unfolding of new consciousness, only the retention of that which is denied or repressed. In an apt description, Hent de Vries draws attention to the convoluted trajectory of responsibility in which what seems a single leitmotif, unlimited, infinite, or absolute responsibility, is unfolded only to be folded in again. This is a quote from de Vries. As might be expected, Blavatsky has a more confrontational view of religious change than Derrida, for she sees repression as a violent act. In describing Christianity's battle against the creeds over which it eventually triumphed, she produces an understanding of conversion as a larger process, well beyond the individual and involving religious expansion and consolidation. The history of world religions cannot be written outside the context of conversion, which Blavatsky takes in its broadest meaning as the propagation of a single religious worldview. That is why she dwells at such length on the secret. The secret denied by Christianity is its own history, its own formation from the heterogeneous religions that fanned beyond Asia toward Europe and the Near East, indeed its very origins in the East. And she has a lot of references to the Oriental Jesus. She writes in her most ambitious work, Eyes Unveiled, and I quote, "Had not the ancient creeds been speedily obliterated, it would have been impossible to preach the Christian religion as a new dispensation or the direct revelation from God the Father through God the Son and under the influence of God the Holy Ghost." Where Blavatsky significantly departs from Derrida is on the issue of Christianity's relation to ethical responsibility. Derrida's introduction of responsibility and conscience considerably alters the course of his argument, which appears to retrace many of Blavatsky's convictions about the cohabitation of Christianity and earlier pagan mysteries, but does so with a different intent. From following a trajectory that reads conversion as a layering of successive secrets, he shifts his focus to an account of how such embedding accounts for the tensions between an ethical progression towards responsibility and the pull of ethno-nationalistic sentiment. To his mind, the residual presence of the orgiastic in responsibility produces religious fervor, which the state takes over to foster a spirit of nationalism. The state, in other words, requires the pagan element in culture in order to keep people in a condition of frenzied passion about the nation as the ultimate expression of the sacred. Festivals, ceremonies, and parades are Pan-like in their orgiastic spirit and advance the idea of the nation as divinely inspired. In its most extreme form, the orgiastic frenzy of the people, so necessary to national celebration, goes awry when it turns into destructive radicalism. No figure better exemplified this conviction about the links between revolutionary passion and paganism than the Abbé Baruel, whose memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism sought to unmask the French Revolution as the culmination of a long history of heresy, stretching all the way back to the Manichaeans of late antiquity through the Freemasons. And in fact, this came up in this morning's session when Alicia made some of her comments. As the survival of dark and anarchic paganism, Jacobinism proved an affinity between the classical past and the revolutionary present that defied its benevolent characterization in the Romantic imagination. What I think this shows is that Derrida is in the grip, I mean, the point that I'm trying to make by putting both Derrida and Blavatsky together is that one can see that Derrida's interest in the derivation of responsibility, which he sees as a response to the revolutionary passion that produces a state-captured nationalism. By doing this, perhaps one can see that Derrida is in the grip of an Enlightenment mode of thought that upholds the trajectory of reason, guiding responsibility's emergence from orgiastic mystery. Surely not oblivious of this contradiction, the only way he can break free from the stranglehold of Enlightenment thought is by recasting the tension between reason and passionate frenzy in the terms of mutual constitution. Derrida resists seeing Christian teleology in a direct progression from darkness to light, from orgiastic mystery to responsibility, and instead argues that the path toward the good, which is another word for responsibility, constantly involves the repression of the orgiastic. In that moment of recognizing the repressed other of responsibility begins historical knowledge. This ongoing cycle of return to the object of repression characterizes Derrida's definition of conversion. The turn to interiority repetitively engages with the path to responsibility. On the other hand, Blavatsky saw the preservation of ancient mysteries as the key to achieving a world order beyond the narrow ethnocentrisms and nationalisms dividing peoples. She rarely uses the word responsibility in her work, nor does she engage with ideas of the Platonic good. But everything in her writing suggests that her idea of responsibility rests on accepting Christianity's multiple historical origins, including those that came to be characterized as heterodox offshoots or mystery religions. She goes so far as to insist that Christian is a term that has a pagan provenance and attests to a secular meaning. She writes, and I quote, "The secular meaning of Christos runs throughout the classical Greek literature, paripasu, with that given to it in the mysteries." But at the same time, she argues that Christos also refers to an Eastern adept or chela, another term for disciple. A great deal of Blavatsky's description of Platonism as the foundation of Christianity resonates with Derrida's argument in The Gift of Death. She describes Clement's Christianity as no more than a graft upon the congenial stock of its original Platonism. And she describes him as an initiate, a new Platonist, before he became a Christian. In a deliberately transgressive move, she insists that the early Christian followers had their own metaphorical transcriptions of Christ as traveler, as truth seeker, as the soul in pursuit of divine wisdom. In short, as the embodiment of gnosis. Blavatsky's exhortation to find the Christos within yourselves had the effect of turning Christ into a metaphor for the search for self-knowledge, so that the meaning of Christ was broadly transformed into that of a good man. Blavatsky uses linguistic etymology to reveal the pagan origin of Christianity, beginning with the pre-Christian name Christos, and then expanding the person of Christ to the Christ condition, and finally to the Mahatmic condition. In short, Jesus is written out of the story, and Christ becomes a place name for truth-seeking. Significantly, Blavatsky metaphorically retells the story of Christ's crucifixion as a journeying from flesh to inner subjective theophany. She links Egyptian rituals associated with the dead body to the Christian notion of the afterlife. I was very struck, by the way, an exhibition just opened recently, a couple of weeks ago, at the Brooklyn Museum on Egyptian pagan and Coptic sculpture. It was really fascinating to see the extent to which the Christian iconography, particularly the sculptures around death, were so almost indistinguishable from the so-called Egyptian pagan, the pagan Egyptian burial customs. And this was one value that I found really quite striking about this exhibition, the degree to which Coptic Christianity is so deeply inflected by Egyptian paganism. And of course, we must also remember that Coptic Christianity and Coptic Christians would claim that they are the first Christians, that Christianity in Africa is not necessarily through the route of missionaries, nor are African Christians, Egyptian Christians, necessarily converts. But like Syrian Christians in India, there is a rightful claim to the title of the first Christians, primarily through the history of Christianity in Egypt. And I thought that really came out very starkly in this present exhibition. So anyone who happens to be in New York in the next couple of months, I would recommend that you take a look at this exhibition. But anyway, just to go back to my own narrative, when she talks about the Egyptian rituals and linking them to the Christian notion of the afterlife, she seeks to bring the time of classical antiquity, including that of Eastern traditions, into the historical time of Judeo-Christianity. Furthermore, she traces the idea of the resurrection to Egyptian mummification and notes that early Christian monuments bear no representation of the historical resurrection of Christ. The closest is Lazarus, whom she refers to as an Egyptian mummy. Lazarus, and I quote from Blavatsky, Lazarus is the Charist, who was the Egyptian Christ, and who was reproduced by Gnostic art in the catacombs of Rome as a form of the Gnostic Christ, who was not and could not become an historical character, unquote. If the resurrected Christ is really Lazarus, where is Jesus? Who is Jesus? To these questions, she avers, thus the child Christ of the historical faith is born and visibly begins in the Charist image of the dead Christ, which was the mummy type of the resurrection in Egypt for thousands of years before the Christian era. This doubles the proof that the Christ of the Christian catacombs was a survival of the Charist of Egypt. The mummy was the earliest human image of the Christ, unquote. In her account of the natural genesis of mysteries, which pushes heterodoxy to its limit, Blavatsky pointedly banalizes the idea of Christ when she writes that the gnosis of mysteries may yield as mundane a proposition as the one that our Christology is mummified mythology. And this is a quote. Tracing Christ to Egypt is not even so much about divine wisdom as it is about gnosis, the knowledge of history, which in its banality contradicts the transcendental, rupturing effects of the Christian narrative. History becomes Blavatsky's code word for a conscious process of displacing hegemonic, exclusionary narratives. As Leon Charette argues in his extremely important book, The Birth of Modernism, nothing is more characteristic of post-Renaissance thinking than the notion that cultural and political change through time is comprehensible and will yield its secrets to scholarly or theoretical investigation. This supposition, which Charette designates by the general term historicism, is shared by such diverse theorists as Vico, Rousseau, Herder, Burke, Hegel, Burckhardt, Nietzsche, and Marx. A corollary of historicism is an epochal view of historical events, because if the past is to be comprehensible, it must be organized into discrete units of measurements, such as epochs. To assume otherwise is to accept history as a disorganized mass of indecipherable secrets. However, the secret does not lead back to something difficult to know, nor to some clear reality deliberately made obscure, which is kind of like the trajectory of detective fiction, but rather the secret refers to a reality to which only the discourse of myth, served by active imagination, is likely to give access. History, when presented as a series of documented events and visible traces, is full of gaps that are far from being the result of loss of empirical data. On the contrary, history is replete with secrets that elude the kinds of action that can be performed on texts to yield their meaning, because concrete, tangible historical events are not what they seem to be at face value. In this sense, history is as much an object of esoteric interpretation as nature. Take, for instance, the writing of the history of Christianity. Seeing the sanctum sanctorum of Mithras in a 12th century Christian church constructed on a 4th century church that was in turn built over a 1st century Mithraeum, and I'm actually referring to the church of San Clemente in Rome. These layers of religion, going into a church like that is akin to stumbling on a secret that unveils the simultaneous orders of historical existence. Such simultaneity opens a window onto a layered history, only imperfectly conveyed by documents on early Christianity, which are assembled and streamlined into a triumphalist narrative. The knowledge is experiential, the experience is iconic, and the icon is a crystallization of unspent energies of historical formation, yielding a new order of perceptual understanding. Secret history is at bottom a notion that leads us back to the distinction between the profane and the sacred. And therefore, it is not a notion that is unique to esotericism. Indeed, far more than generally acknowledged, it is germane to historical knowledge itself. And I want to illustrate that point by turning now to Yeats's The Manuscript of Leo Africanus, which, as a lesson in the simultaneous experience of history, akin to the experience I was just describing of going into this church, which has these 3 layers of religions. To read this text is also to enter into the poet's engagement with the spirit of a 16th century African Arab scholar, linguist, and poet, who, by narrating his life of forcible conversion and the secret practice of Islam, reveals to Yeats the fissures in Europe's understanding of Africa and the limits of his conception of Irish history. The whole point of Leo's occult transmissions is to convey to Yeats a world much larger than his, in which colonialism and conversion combined to produce not wholly stable identities, identities that Leo, at the same time, acknowledges as instances of the historical changes set in motion by European expansion. In 1912, during a period when he frequented many seances, Yeats first felt contact from a spirit claiming the name of Leo. Even though the spirit had a strong Irish accent, this voice from the dead described himself as a Moorish writer and explorer. Claiming to have been with Yeats since childhood as his alternative or opposite self, Leo asks the poet to write to him as if to Africa. In a curious conflation of the past life of a dead being with textual presence, Yeats's discovery of Leo's original name comes about only after Yeats researches Chambers' biographical dictionary, where he learns that Leo was formerly Al-Hassan ibn Muhammad al-Wazir al-Fasi, a 16th century Spanish Arab poet and explorer captured as a Roman slave and then subsequently forced to convert to Christianity. So here's Yeats's first instinct to rush to his encyclopedia or his Chambers dictionary in order to fix the identity of this disembodied voice. So here's Leo, who was a Spanish Moor, born in Granada, exiled to North Africa after the invasion of Granada by a Catholic coalition, and later kidnapped and placed in the service of Pope Leo X, who gave Leo the slave his Christian name. Leo's position of exile bears a remarkable resemblance to Yeats's dual estrangement from Ireland and Catholicism under British rule, a point that Leo emphasizes in his push to make Yeats enlarge his understanding of world history. Leo's insistence that Yeats write to him as if he were still living among the Moors and the Sudanese acquires a particular poignancy in the context of his servitude, forcible conversion, and subsequent erasure of his African identity. In his communications with Yeats, Leo, defying his condition of slavery, comes across as perpetually migratory, multilingual, religiously adaptive, and therefore not easily captured by the fixed ethnographic categories that served the empire so well. In fact, this goes back to something I think that Sean was talking about this morning, when he was referring to a situation in Africa where intermediaries, so-called native intermediaries, who were given the task of officially compiling a record of the customs and practices, religious practices of the people, virtually sort of took away those practices and put them, captured them in this textual form. But in this occult transmission, Leo militates against his very identification in a particular way in the texts that have been that have become part of the historical record. And of course, Renaissance scholars are very familiar with Leo Africanus because of the descriptions of Africa that served as a crucial source text for many of the ideas of Africa guiding European explorers. So in this sense, Leo's occult transmissions defies those fixed ethnographic categories. In Yeats's text, Leo Africanus is strategically poised between the figure of a ghost and social personhood. Indeed, it is worth recalling Avery Gordon's observation that ghost and social figure have to be conjoined in order for a haunting to take place. The ghost that is not simply a dead or missing person cannot, in the words of Horkheimer and Adorno, be reduced to a mere sequence of instantaneous experiences which leave no trace. Narrated through a tin trumpet and all the paraphernalia of mediums and seances, Leo's story of Africa, colonialism, and slavery makes him both native informant and anti-colonialist. That is to say, he appears to be a native informant when his records of travel are incorporated into European writings on geographical exploration. But Leo is also fiercely an anti-colonialist, as when his disembodied voice taunts Yeats for his skepticism and rationality as prime causes for the poet's failure to recognize the not wholly stable identity produced by colonialism. In fact, this phrase, not wholly stable, is one that comes from Leo's text. Leo chides Yeats for being a man of his age, only able to, quote, recognize what in the best opinion of your time has been proved by deductive science. You insist on considering spirits as unknown causes, though they have interfered in your own life often enough. And the exchange between Leo and Yeats is not entirely dissimilar from the exchange that some of you who are reading the Ordinary Business of Occultism article might have become familiar with, the exchange between the spirit of the present, the voice of Kuthumi, the Tibetan master, and his English interlocutor. Leo, who is heteroglossic to a fault, represents transgression itself in his ability to communicate with all people, the dead, the living, Africans, Arabs, Europeans. He even enters the body of a rabbit. Leo's self-narration begins with this saying, after my death in battle. That's the first line of the text, after my death in battle. The fact that he has memories like a living person is explained by the idea that, and I quote from Leo, memory is not seated in the physical body, but in a more delicate body. I think Leo was speaking to your series, and in his own sort of spectral way, he sort of was cued into what you were up to. So Leo's memory, even in death, requires him to be known, however provisionally and skeptically, as if he were still living. And such an imaginative gesture both apprehends his social figuration and expunges his ghost. Leo remarks that his delicate body housing memory is a function of the spiritus mundi that your century, and he speaks to Yeats, your century has named the unconscious. So here he's doing something that we actually talked about this morning. Leo is suggesting that even these categories that have emerged, your unconscious, your notion of what a ghost is, your notion of memory, that all of these are artifacts of an increasing space, an increasing attempt to place reason in a privileged position over its other. And Leo is mocking that polarization when he says, your century has named this the unconscious. But the world in which images are formed is a radically social world. And then Leo says, for we can share each memory like souls drifting together and build a common world, just as it sometimes happened that two sleeping men or a sleeping man and woman will share the same dream. Most importantly, the voice of Leo's spirit reaches Yeats not as private mystical experience, but as public history. Nothing in the text conveys this effect more than Leo's conjoining of two geographies to show the scale of a world much larger than the one dominated by the West. And I quote from Leo, side by side with the streets of Fez or desert, I seemed to see another world that was growing in weight and vividness, the double of yours, but vaster and more significant. Such a vision cannot be told in the sequential narrative of Western history, but requires a simultaneous experiencing of seemingly disparate moments in time and space. Yeats's use of the occult collapses the binaries between us versus them, opening the door to an exploration of hidden or repressed histories that dislocates the local as the time and space of immediate experience. It is precisely this dislocation of the local that enables the writing of another kind of history in which an ethical knowledge of the effects of religious conversion and crypto-conversion can be produced. Such knowledge literally requires the dead to speak, and not simply through the texts that appropriate and become mute stand-ins for the actual voices of historical subjects. And again, this speaks to, I think, a theoretical problematic issue that we were talking about this morning, which is about, what do we do when we're confronted with texts that are adduced to be subversive or revolutionary or conspiratorial or anti-colonialist, and are such texts then marked as threatening, as dangerous? And are there elements of those texts that are considered to be non-contaminating, and they are sometimes described as mystical or spiritual or religious or whatever? And so in a similar way, what I think is going on here is this idea that Leo completely contests the notion that these texts can become so fixed, and that the voices of the subjects within those texts can become so stabilized, as if to signify that those are the real. I'm trying to avoid words like the real, because I think that's one of the issues that he's trying to undermine, that this sense of the real is constantly opposing to it the idea of the non-real or the fabulous or the fantastic or the magical or whatever. But that what Leo is ultimately doing is, in a sense, to overcome his existence as a textualized history, and through these occult transmissions to see his voice as forcing a recognition of a history that has remained a secret that cannot be named, a secret that cannot be identified. So Leo's occult transmission offers a corrective to the work he performed in the Pope's service, when as a new convert to Christianity, he was asked to write historical tracts, particularly about his homeland of North Africa, which of course was his land of exile, not even his homeland at all. Not only were the tracts written in the condition of slavery, but Leo Africanus's A Geographical History of Africa, written in Arabic and Italian, this is a long title, by Leo A. Moore, born in Granada and brought up in Barbary. This text with his long name was later appropriated as a pro-imperialist text, thus wresting from the author any control he may have had over the meaning of his work. Indeed, Michael Tausig's misreading of Leo Africanus is possible only, and I think this is something he writes in his book Shamanism and Colonialism and the Wild Man on Shamanism. And Michael Tausig talks a little bit about Leo Africanus, not Yeats's Leo Africanus, but Leo Africanus in the Renaissance texts. And Tausig says, and I think one reason why his misreading is possible, it's only because of the way this very work circulates in subsequent anthropological accounts. And Tausig writes, and I quote from Colonialism and the Wild Man, "Whatever the role of this spirit in the formation of the modern anti-self, it comes as somewhat of a shock to be informed by Margaret Hodgin in her early anthropology in the 16th and 17th centuries that Leo Africanus declared that Negroes not only led a beastly life, but were utterly destitute of reason." So he sees this sentence and takes this as Leo's historical representation. And such is the legacy of Leo Africanus when he enters the anthropological literature. And it's actually been very difficult to disentangle Leo from this anthropological literature. So I think I should conclude soon, because I do see that time is marching. And I just wanted to say, by way of conclusion, which I have to confess is also inconclusive in many respects, but that's okay. I hope you'll think it's okay. Let me ask this question: why would an obscure work in the Yeats corpus be important at all as a key text in my effort to understand crypto-conversion? After all, few critics are willing to concede an integral importance to Yeats's occult phase, other than to see it as offering an elaborate repertoire of symbols that eventually spring free from their occult moorings and get reconstituted as a defining feature of Yeats's imagination. And here, even though Yeats has had post-colonial readings in this revisionist move, and there's been this excellent work from Edward Said, Seamus Dean, Kyberd, Declan Kyberd, David Lloyd, all of whom have done yeoman's work in recontextualizing Yeats within a post-colonial frame. But at the same time, the repositioning of Yeats as a post-colonial thinker and an anti-colonial writer has also been, I think, at the cost of dismissing his occult phase, because it's been so hard to reconcile Yeats's occultism with his post-colonial radicalism. And therefore, the only way has been to see Yeats's occultism as a minor aberration, charming and quaint, but not having much significance beyond that. Though I do think there has been something of a shift recently, even in that perspective. I was heartened, in fact, to see at a recent exhibition, I think it was last year in the National Library in Dublin. I don't know if any of you went to the Yeats exhibition there, but it really accented Yeats's occultism and showed in a fairly extensive way Yeats's complete absorption by occult themes, and something I didn't know. Apparently, he designed his own tarot cards, and which were all out there in the exhibition, and the robes that he designed for going to the meetings of the what is it, the Golden Age of the dawn, something. There's a dawn and a golden age. I'm not sure which order it is in, but whatever. So, but it was interesting to actually see the way that Yeats's occult phase was more prominently foregrounded than perhaps I had seen before. But so so Yeats's occultism, and I think it has been best expressed by Leon Schoret, who says, like Pound's fascism, Yeats's occultism has been a subject not to be raised in polite company. Yet I will argue that the relevance of the occult for illuminating religious conversion is precisely that as a response to the crisis of knowledge, occultism challenged the received developmental narratives of official knowledge and salvaged obliterated histories, cultures, and beliefs by means that were at once non-temporal and non-spatial. In its response to the crisis of science and knowledge in the late 19th century, and in its symptomatic questioning of representationalism and aesthetics and philosophy, modern occultism can loosely, very loosely, and I say this very guardedly, can loosely be described as anticipating some of the ethical concerns of post-structuralism and postmodernism. If figurative and representational art constrained the colonized world, release from representationalism provided a freer way of expressing the historical experience of colonization, at least, I would say in the context of the manuscript of Leo Africanus. Yeats's agonistic encounter with Leo's spirit in the geographies of the historical imagination shifts the register of discovering the past through language or textuality. Leo appears before the poet through mediumship, to be sure. But the vivid reality of other worlds beyond Yeats's immediate grasp comes about through the ethical turn represented by Leo's archaeological method of reconstructing the poet's memory of forgotten, repressed histories. And it is in this moment that the secret of history is seen to lie in its historicity. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Gauri, for that very rich talk. We have some time for questions. David,
I was, this is a small point, but you mentioned that Blavatsky said that the mummy was the earliest form of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you know the novel Wise Blood. It was written in 52 by Flannery O'Connor, the first novel. And it's considered to be the great American novel on religion. And it's all about a young man who's adamantly against religion, and so much so that he decides to found a church, and the church is called the Church of the World Without Christ.
Wow.
And he goes through the entire novel, and then at one point, his double steals a mummy from a museum, wraps it in newspaper, and throws it at the protagonist, saying, "This is the actual Christ."
Wow,
So
this is amazing.
Sort of follows it.
This is incredible. What's the name of the
Wise Blood
Wise Blood? Huh.
by Flannery O'Connor. It was made in 1975. It was made the film by John Huston. It's a really great film, but the novel
It's brilliant. Yeah.
so much
Yeah.
better.
Yeah.
You'll see what I mean when you read
Yeah. Thank you so much. This is great. Thank you so much. Sorry that I went maybe a little longer than you would have wished.
I was actually very interested in the literature scholar. You're kind of providing the genealogy of Yeats's relationship with the vision of the Africanus, and what I was thinking of was, obviously Yeats has his own vision of history, which comes out in his poems, Byzantium, City to Byzantium, and his vision of history as a gyre, which we read a lot. So, is that something which, from this vision of Leo Africanus, this kind of very peculiar vision of how historical epochs kind of cycles of fashion.
I don't know if he takes it from Leo Africanus, but I think they are part of a shared discourse, as it is, because I think he was taking the notion of the gyre as kind of that history can never move until it comes back to the same point, and it has to proceed in a kind of spiraling direction. And I think that the direction of the manuscript of Leo Africanus, at least in the way in which that narrative unfolds, the story of Leo Africanus is exactly like that. I mean, as I said, it begins by saying, "After my death in battle." That's the way that he launches into into his narrative. So the narrative is not one that begins in life and progresses through the sort of the normal passages of life, but begins at a point that is beyond life, and then circles back towards his home, towards the place where he was a Muslim, and subsequently lost that Muslim identity through exile, through forcible conversion, and then subsequently working in the employment of the Pope. So I would say that it's part of that shared discourse in Yeats's imagination. Yes, that's right. Right. Yeah. I mean, Leo appears in the vision too. Normally, I think he calls him the tormentor. The Leo is this very like a malevolent spirit, so Leo comes at him, badgering him, and he writes about Leo as someone to be fearful of. That's not quite the that's not the. That's not continuous with the narrative that appears in the manuscript of Leo Africanus, but in the vision it keeps coming back. Leo keeps reappearing as a spirit that is constantly reminding Yeats of what he is unwilling to or unable to acknowledge, and to that extent he keeps referring to Leo as his tormentor.
Mm-hmm. I never thought about that before, but just listening to you, I found that interesting because crypto conversions, at least what I know of, mostly refer to the converted Jews, and the secrecy is about, or the secrecy is at the side of the converted. They are Christian, but they still hold to Judaism or their traditional beliefs tied to ethnicity. But the secrecy is not seen at the side of the converter. And just listening to you, I remember the conversions to Christianity, let's say some kind of second age Christianity, because the former one was in the 3rd, 4th century, as you mentioned, in Egypt, Coptic, etc. But the new conversion, the new evangelization, which comes with the discovery of Africa, the Portuguese arriving, let's say, in the old kingdom of the Congo. But those kings converted to Christianity, not because they were convinced by the doctrine or any aspect. Their goal for conversion, and they say it explicitly, was to discover the secrets of the whites. What was the secret to their power of
it's like a Trojan horse kind of.
And imposing their rules to the others. So the secrecy really, in that case, is on the other side. Of course, those kings were also, although officially Christians, they were still holding to traditional beliefs and practices. But they wanted to discover the secret, which was beyond Christianity.
No, sure, and I know the term crypto conversion does have these multiple meanings, and sometimes it does sound ambiguous. And it's of course the case that I was referring, in fact, to the Marano the Moriscos. You know, the idea that there are converts who retain their identity, their, you know, sort of their original, whatever the original is, but they retain their identity even though they might have converted to, you know, the religion of the place could either be the dominant religion or otherwise, but generally out of force or convenience, which they have somehow accepted, made into a pragmatic decision. And the crypto conversion relates to the fact that individual communities retain their original practices, even though, you know, they swear allegiance to some other religion. And, you know, one sees that in the Murano, the idea of the Murano in England, and the idea of Jewishness. As Daniel Deronda, I think, is a great novel to think about, George Eliot's novel of, you know, the idea that conversion is giving over, you know, the sense of continuity with, you know, the traditions and the customs that have been passed down over the generations. So that does remain a secret. You know, in that sense, it is a crypto conversion. The other kind of conversion that you're saying is, again, a kind of strategic conversion. It's to get into the mindset of the other in order to sort of undermine from within, like a Trojan horse. I think, you know, in the case of you know, Derrida's The Gift of Death and the way that he writes about religion, he notes that. I mean, let's not forget his own identity. You know, I think that's no doubt one of the driving forces of, you know, what he does write, what he does say about religion. But he also wants to get beyond that to try to understand religions from a perspective that is much larger than the individual's identity. At least that's how I read it. I think he's trying to understand what it is in the course of historical development has moved people towards one particular conception of faith as opposed to another conception, and what has it involved them to give up in the process of moving towards that towards that other faith. And in fact, I was thinking, ironically, you know, Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, a big mammoth book, which probably is more readable in some of the earlier essay forms, because I think his arguments tend to be more precise than in the longer version. But what's interesting about Taylor's idea of secularism is that he sees Christianity as a kind of as you know, what triggers the movement towards secularism, because what he sees Christianity doing is permitting a move towards a more humanistic expression of self, and that therefore Christianity paves the way for a secularized worldview and a secularized culture. And but the question, and I think if one put Derrida and Taylor in the same room, or I guess Derrida would have to be in the position of Leo right now, would be to have them, you know, converse with each other, because I think Derrida would say that that idea, that account of secularization fails to acknowledge the extent to which that push into a kind of humanist worldview is, that push into that humanist worldview represses the Platonist drive towards the good, which has little to do with humanism as such, but it's part of a very complicated trajectory that Derrida sees as the legacy of secularism. That to write the history of secularism is not a narrative that can be charted in the kinds of linear ways that perhaps you do find in Taylor. I mean, his move, I think, is necessary for him to make, because he's trying to argue that there is not that radical discontinuity between religion and secularism. But it produces exactly the effect that I think Derrida was trying to make, which is that it represses a historical experience, and it renders that repressed historical experience as a secret that remains at the bottom of sort of the secular legacy.
Thanks very much. There's so much in your talk that, as we were saying, speaks to this series. But I was really intrigued with how you were building the argument, and you developed the notion, of course, that we've heard of let's say, the layers of, in this case, historical church constructions that are one iteration upon another. We see so many examples, let's say, in Spain, in Granada, the Catholic Church on the mosque, or in Latin America, the Catholic Church on the indigenous Incan temple. But I'm wondering if you really find it compelling, the argument that this is to be read as layers of mystery, or retained mystery that subverts or obscures linearity. Because for a historian, it's a pretty clear linear historical story. And so right there I was struggling to defend that.
No, this is a great question, and I would also add to the list that you gave, mosques over Hindu temples, which is, of course, one of the great political issue right now in India. And of course, you know, I mean, one can definitely write that as a, you know, a history of conquest. In fact, I just finished teaching the Moonstone to my undergraduate students, and it opens with that scene of the conquest of the Muslim conquest of India, and the destruction of the temple, and the destruction of the idols, and then the English colonization comes on. And so you do have that kind of sequence already laid out in Wilkie Collins. But Wilkie Collins does do something which is sort of, he also disrupts that narrative, that historical narrative. The novel begins with the conquest of the Muslim destruction of the temple, and then the English conquest of India, and it ends again with that same image, but with the stone restored, but within the context of the destroyed temples. But what happens in between is this whole mystery, the secret of the Moonstone, the disappearance of the Moonstone, the intangible value of the Moonstone. Is it object? Is it sacred object, or is it ornamentation? Does it have value if it is broken up into pieces, which is what some of the characters want to do? Does it retain sacred value if it is broken down? So that what Wilkie Collins does in a very curious way is to restore mystery to a narrative which seems to have that kind of linear, you know, that linear flow. And I think Collins constantly reminds one that through these images, you know, whether it's the Moonstone or whatever, that that very little, that, you know, you can know the history through the way it is recounted, but you cannot quite understand what that history signifies until you begin to regard it as a secret, that there is something that is yet to be known. And much of the novel unfolds as a kind of psychological exploration of the meaning of the secret. And the characters sort of undergo that same examination about themselves, about their relationship to others within the society, to their relationship to India as a British colony. So there's that sense in which historically, yes, you know, the narrative can be unfolded in this sequential way. But what the Moonstone, as, you know, this very problematic mystery, this object does, is to unsettle the certainties of that history, and to ask, how does one understand the value of what that history signifies? Can that value be understood through a linear account of this invasion followed that invasion, followed that invasion, and so forth. So, and maybe this speaks to something you were a bit unhappy about, that we didn't talk enough about literature. But it seems to me that that's where, you know, some of the contributions of literary studies can go. And I was struck, in fact, when in reading Derrida, that this idea that the idea of the mystery and the secret are interruptions to received historical knowledge, and I would put that in the context of what literature can do through readings of this kind. But I think your question is a really good one, and I really take your point. I brought in this the Church of San Clemente in Rome because it spoke so eloquently to me about what it was. I mean, I could go into the books and recount the history of each of those various levels. But there was something in the actual fact of the Sanctum Sanctorum, which, you know, where we go in and you actually see the image of Mithras, which seemed to be, it exceeded what the historical account could narrate. And it produced that sense of I spoke about this as a kind of experiential knowledge. It may not have been, you know, a very good way of expressing it, but it produced a different order of knowledge that I couldn't quite get out of the historical accounts. And it really did come out of the imagery of Mithras and the prevalence of the Mithras imagery in not only in Rome, but obviously in Persia and in India, and also the connection between Mithras and Christ, which is the other. In fact, I found it very interesting. I never knew this, but apparently Martin Luther King wrote his senior thesis on Mithras and the cult of Mithras and Christianity, which I read somewhere. It was fascinating because I hadn't quite, I just sort of stumbled on this when I was just curious, because it was producing this need to know what this signified. And the cult of Mithras had some impact on Martin Luther King, which I'm not sure anybody has fully accounted for. I mean, here is somebody who we see as as a person of the church, you know, aligning the the idea of freedom from oppression to kind of Christian command, but you know, his reading was so heavily in the cult of Mithras, so. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also a story with Greek as well as with literary historians, that you're finding the material for reception more than narration. Mm-hmm. The examples you give, or I was just thinking, I was not too long ago at the Alhambra in Granada, where the Catholic Church imposed on the mosque, the former mosque, and the baptismal font in the Catholic Church is an ornamental clamshell of the original mosque, you know, of the naturalism of the original architecture. And I think, to go along with your argument, a Granadan, a Christian Granadan, couldn't help but note and in some way receive the naturalism of this original artifact, even though it's used.
So interesting, yeah. Yes, right, yeah. And I think something similar in the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, again with the mosque and the church, you know, and the sense of, you know, here's the prayer, the pulpit, the prayer pulpit, the Islamic prayer pulpit, right at the, and then at its base is the baptismal fount. So, you know, it's the contiguity of this imagery that is really astounding when you think about it, and how to tell that story. I think, you know, I may not have done that well, but I think this is something that I'm thinking about all the time. How does one tell that story of that contiguity without resorting to the linearity of historical narration, but without simply sort of relegating it to some kind of abstract theoretical formulation. But it seems to me that it needs to be done experientially in some way, to find a language, to get at that experiential level of that simultaneity that one sees, iconically. But thank you very much. I think that's great.
We can continue the discussion with a glass of wine. Thanks very much for wonderful talk. Also shown the subliminal reach of our series. How far it goes. So thanks again, Gauri.
Thank you.